year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions?
Well, can I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House. We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms. Thank you.
This week, a prominent Labour MP was questioned over unfulfilled promises regarding inheritance tax on agricultural properties, amidst massive protests by farmers who took to the streets in several cities across the country. The demonstrators are demanding answers about recent tax changes, which they believe contradict the party's commitments made during the election campaign. During the interrogation, the MP defended the government's decisions, arguing that they were due to the difficult economic situation and rejected any accusations of broken promises. However, discontent among farmers continues to grow due to fears over the consequences of these reforms. Will the government be able to calm widespread outrage? Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us a lot. Let's begin. The protest, which brought together thousands of farmers, focused on the rejection of recent changes to inheritance tax on agricultural properties. During the election campaign, the Labour Party promised that no changes would be made to this policy, a pledge which raised expectations of stability in the sector. However, the introduction of reforms has sparked discontent among those who rely on farming as their main source of income. The inheritance tax, as it stood before the reforms, allowed many farming families to pass down their land from generation to generation without significant tax burdens. With the new adjustments, agricultural land valued over £1 million will be subject to a considerable increase in taxes. This, according to protest leaders, not only threatens the sustainability of family farms, but also puts the country's food security at risk. The protests spread to several major cities, with farmers carrying placards accusing the government of betraying its promises. A statement issued by the main agricultural union emphasized that these disproportionate fiscal policies primarily affect small and medium-sized farmers who face unfair competition from large agricultural corporations. The discontent is not limited to the inheritance tax increase. Farmers argue that these measures are part of a broader pattern of policies that disadvantage the rural sector, compounding problems in a context where they already face challenges such as rising production costs, inflation, and the effects of climate change. As the protests grow in intensity, farmers have demanded direct meetings with government representatives, calling for clear explanations and asking for the reforms to be reversed. However, so far, the government's response has focused on justifying the measures as part of a necessary strategy for the country's economic recovery. In response to growing criticism and protests, a Labour MP who sits on the committee responsible for economic affairs was questioned about the reforms during an interview on a news program. The official defended the changes to inheritance tax by arguing that the government had inherited a complicated financial situation from the previous administration. According to her, difficult decisions were inevitable to stabilize the national economy. Although she insisted that the reforms did not constitute a breach of election promises, she avoided directly answering whether these contradicted the commitments made before the election. "We have always made it clear that our priorities would be guided by the economic context at the time," she said, suggesting that the changes were necessary to ensure sustainable growth. This defense, however, has not succeeded in easing the criticism. Protesters and some members of the opposition have pointed out that the official explanation does not address the central concern: the disproportionate burden these policies impose on small farmers, who make up a significant portion of the country's food production. In an attempt to ease tensions, the government stated that the revenue generated from the new taxes would be allocated to fund rural development programs and sustainable agricultural technologies. However, many farmers consider these promises insufficient, arguing that the long-term benefits do not compensate for the immediate and devastating impact the reforms will have on their income and livelihoods. Some political analysts have also questioned the government's communication strategy, suggesting that the refusal to acknowledge broken promises is undermining public trust. A public policy expert commented, "The government seems more concerned with justifying its actions than addressing the legitimate concerns of the affected sectors. The interviewed MP assured that the criticism was part of the democratic process and that the government was willing to engage in dialogue with farmers to explore possible adjustments. However, no concrete measures have been announced so far to ease tensions or modify the current policy. The changes made to inheritance tax have generated widespread concern among farmers and various sectors related to the rural economy. The reform stipulates that agricultural properties worth over £1 million will be subject to a significantly higher tax burden, which poses a direct blow to small and medium-sized farmers. Prior to this modification, family farms enjoyed certain tax exemptions, allowing families to pass down their assets to future generations without facing overwhelming financial pressure. This was particularly crucial in a sector where profits are often limited and margins are tight. With the new scheme, there are fears that many families will not be able to bear the additional costs, being forced to sell parts of their land or even abandon farming altogether. The economic implications are profound. According to estimates from agricultural associations, more than 30% of the country's small family farms could be affected by this reform in the next 5 years. These lands, which have traditionally served as the foundation for the country's domestic food production, are at risk of being absorbed by large corporations or property developers, which could irreversibly alter the agricultural landscape of the country. Experts warn that the impact is not limited to individual farms. A reduction in the number of small farmers could have a cascading effect on the entire rural economy. Suppliers of agricultural inputs, such as seeds and fertilizers, as well as machinery and transport services, could face decreased demand. Furthermore, rural communities, already battling depopulation, could lose even more people as families leave their land. The social aspect is also a cause for concern. Agriculture in many cases is not just an economic activity, but a way of life deeply rooted in family and cultural traditions. For the affected families, losing their land means not only losing their livelihood, but also their connection to their history and identity. On the other hand, it has been pointed out that the design of the reform appears to favor large-scale agricultural operations and agro-industrial companies, which have greater resources to absorb the fiscal impact. This could lead to a concentration of land in fewer hands, increasing inequality in the sector. At the same time, some analysts argue that the greater presence of corporations could lead to more industrialized farming, which could affect environmental sustainability and crop diversity. In terms of food production, the changes could also have significant consequences. With fewer small farmers in operation, local production could decrease, forcing the country to rely more on imports. This would not only increase costs for consumers, but also expose the country to risks associated with international market volatility and disruptions in the global supply chain. Meanwhile, farmers' rights organizations have pointed out that the reform could also have a psychological impact on those affected. The pressure of dealing with a sudden increase in taxes, compounded by existing challenges in the sector, such as rising costs and the effects of climate change, could raise stress levels and affect the mental health of many farmers. To illustrate the impact more concretely, a specific case has resonated in the media. A farming family that has been working a 200-hectare farm for 3 generations stated that the new tax burden represents 40% of the annual income generated by their crops. "We are watching how all the effort of previous generations could disappear in a matter of years. We're being forced to make decisions we never thought we'd have to face," said the head of the family during one of the protests. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us a lot. Let's continue. The government, for its part, has attempted to downplay these concerns by arguing that only a minority of farms will be affected by the changes. However, the figures presented by industry associations seem to contradict this claim, showing that the scope of the reforms could be much broader than anticipated. The voices of those directly related to agriculture have not been silent in response to changes in the inheritance tax. While the government insists on minimizing the impact of the reforms, representatives from various rural areas have warned of a bleak outlook if current policies are not revisited. One of the most affected groups, small farmers, has made their position clear. They believe these measures pose a threat to the sustainability of their operations and the future of the sector. In statements to the media, some farmers express that the policies not only ignore the realities of agricultural work, but also benefit large conglomerates. "We are witnessing how family farms are being pushed towards extinction, and no one seems to understand the impact this will have on food production," said a union leader during a protest in a rural area. Butchers and other workers in the food chain have also raised their voices. According to these sectors, the collapse of small farms could affect the quality and availability of local products. For them, increased increased reliance on imports not only raises costs but also jeopardizes national food security. A representative from a butchers association stated, "When small farmers disappear, it's not just production that's lost, but also the connection to responsible and sustainable farming practices. The food we import doesn't always meet the same standards we have here." Furthermore, from an economic standpoint, rural development experts have pointed out that the closure of small farms would have wider effects on rural communities. Local businesses that depend on agricultural trade, such as suppliers of machinery, seeds, and transport services, would also suffer a significant reduction in demand. This not only affects the income of these businesses, but could also contribute to an increase in unemployment in areas where job opportunities are already limited. On the other hand, environmental organizations have raised concerns about the ecological impact of land concentration in the hands of large corporations. According to their statements, small farmers are more likely to maintain diversified and sustainable farming practices, while large companies tend to prioritize maximizing production, often resulting in intensive monocultures and excessive use of natural resources. A recurring argument among the affected sectors is that the government has not offered enough alternatives or support to mitigate the negative effects of the reform. While resources have been announced to promote agricultural sustainability, many farmers have stated that these funds will not be sufficient to offset the increased taxes. They promise us incentives to produce sustainably, but at the same time, they impose tax burdens that make any long-term investment unfeasible, said one farmer during an interview. From an academic perspective, rural sociologists have warned about the social impact of these measures. Families that depend on farming as a tradition and way of life could be forced to abandon their land, severing historical ties with their communities. Furthermore, rural depopulation could exacerbate issues such as an aging population in agricultural areas. One sector that has been particularly vocal is the agricultural unions, who have presented data that contradict the government's statements regarding the limited scope of the reform. According to a recent report, more than 40% of the country's family farms exceed the £1 million threshold in value, placing them directly within the range affected by the increased inheritance tax. The unions have urged the government to reconsider the policy and to consider additional exemptions to ensure that small farmers can continue operating. Even within the financial sector, banks have expressed concerns about how this situation could affect the rural economic stability. Indebted farmers may face greater difficulties in meeting their financial obligations, which would increase the risk of defaults and losses for the banking institutions that back agricultural loans. In parallel, there have been heartfelt testimonies from farmers who fear losing their land. A third-generation young farmer recounted how his family has worked for decades to build a sustainable operation, but now faces the possibility of having to sell part of their property. "My grandfather started with only a few acres, and now it seems that all that wasn't enough. This tax is wiping out generations of effort," he said, visibly upset. Another affected group that has begun to mobilize is the consumers, concerned about the impact of these policies on food prices. While the government has assured that the reforms will not affect the majority of farms, consumers fear that a reduction in local production will lead to greater reliance on imports, which will inevitably drive up the prices of basic goods. Finally, a coalition of affected groups has issued a joint call for the government to initiate an open and transparent dialogue with all sectors involved. Their main demand is the creation of an independent committee to assess the short and long-term effects of the reform and propose solutions that balance the need for tax revenue with the protection of the agricultural sector and rural communities. In response to the growing protests, the government has defended the inheritance tax reform, assuring that it will only affect a small proportion of farms, particularly the larger ones. According to the Secretary of the Environment, the reforms aim to achieve a more equitable distribution of the tax burden and align with the country's financing needs. The government emphasizes that these reforms are necessary due to the inherited fiscal deficit and that large farms valued over £1 million are the most capable of bearing the fiscal impact. It is estimated that only 10% of agricultural operations will be affected, and implementation will be gradual to minimize the impact. Additionally, the government has allocated resources to support the transition to more sustainable farming practices, with incentives for modernizing farms and promoting research into ecological methods. The reform is part of a package of measures aimed at ensuring the viability of the agricultural sector. The administration insists that small farms will not be affected as the reforms target larger farms, which have the resources to cope with the adjustments without compromising their viability. They also claim that the reform will not significantly alter the supply of agricultural products, as only a small percentage of the affected farms will reduce their size or sell their land. The government also highlights that 35% of the population supports the reforms as a necessary measure for economic stability, defending their decision not to reconsider the reform due to the financial crisis. Protests continue, and the resistance of those affected suggests that tax reforms will remain a relevant issue. The impact will not only be economic but also social, as the disappearance of family farms could affect the social fabric of rural areas. The government has allocated resources to improve agricultural efficiency and address future challenges, though many sectors consider this response insufficient in light of the immediate effects of the reforms. In the long term, the fiscal reforms could change the agricultural landscape of the country. While the government maintains that the effects will be limited, the opposition suggests that the reform could be a key issue in the upcoming elections. Farmers' demands will continue to push for reconsideration of these decisions. If you like this video and want to see more content on important issues, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support helps us continue creating content. Thanks for being with us, and don't forget to share this video. See you next time.